Hello, this is Salvatore Vinciguerra, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you the Andersonville National Historic Site and the National Prisoner of War Museum located in Andersonville, Georgia. First, I'm going to take you inside of the National Prisoner of War Museum. I'll be posing the question, who is a prisoner of war? And I'll be sharing with you the various artifacts that are on display inside the museum in these various exhibits. Then I'll be taking you outside to see the Andersonville prison, which is also known as Camp Sumter, a Confederate prisoner of war camp, and this is one of the reasons why our nation has decided to put the National Prisoner of War Museum here in Andersonville, Georgia. Just a few warnings to those people wishing to visit the Anderson Historical Site and National Prisoner of War Museum is that, first of all, when you visit inside of the Prisoner of War Museum, that these exhibits are not in any type of order, and it's not designed to be experienced like that. You're supposed to go into different parts of the museum and just go ahead and experience that one exhibit, and it flows very nicely inside of here. Just a warning, if you are bringing young children, you may have to educate them as to what they are seeing, and for some parents they may not feel that some of the images and some of the exhibits are appropriate for young children. It's very dark in here, as just a little criticism of this museum, but that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to actually bring an awareness to who or what is a prisoner of war. Here's a synopsis of Prisoners of War in American History by Alan Marsh, written in 1998. Freedom has not come free. No one can attest to this better than the men and women who have served in the armed forces of this great nation we call the United States of America. No one knows better what it is like to have that freedom suddenly snatched away than those individuals who, in the process of serving their country, have found themselves prisoners of war. It is an experience neither asked nor desired. Most Americans who have been prisoners of war are ordinary people who have been placed in extraordinary circumstances by no planning of their own. Americans have been held captive as prisoners of war during many wars and in many places. Still, there is a common bond that is shared by all. Their story is an inspiring chapter of our history as a nation. During the Revolutionary War, an estimated 20,000 Americans were held as prisoners of war and 8,500 died in captivity. Some were subsequently released as a part of an exchange system between America and Great Britain. Many, however, were not that fortunate. Some were kept in British jails, but for many, life as a prisoner of war was spent in the damp, musty holds of vessels. These prison ships were anchored in Walnut Bay, New York, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and in St. Lucia, West Indies. For those who died, their bodies were tossed overboard or taken ashore and buried in shallow graves. After the American Revolution, although America was no longer at war, many American sailors became captives at the hands of the Barbary pirates of North Africa and were used as slave labor until ransomed. During the War of 1812, Great Britain renewed its hostilities. Consequently, prisoners of war, initially American prisoners of war, were once again kept in prison ships until 1813, when they were taken to England and held in prisons, such as the infamous Dartmoor. The stone walls of the Dartmoor, located in Devonshire, enclosed 400 barracks, and according to prisoner of war Charles Andrews, death itself, with hopes of an hereafter, seemed less terrible than this gloomy prison. In 1815, more than 5,000 prisoners of war left Dartmoor. At least 252 did not return to America, casualties of the hated prison. One of the most celebrated arts of this war was the composition of the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key was aboard a British vessel in Baltimore Harbor, attempting to win the release of a prisoner of war when he penned the famous words, "America's national anthem is the only one in the world written by a prisoner of war." During the Civil War, an estimated 190,000 Union soldiers and 214,000 Confederate soldiers became prisoners of war, more than in any other conflict in the history of the country. Approximately 30,000 Union soldiers died in Confederate prisons, while the death rate was almost as bad in the North, with approximately 26,000 Confederate soldiers dying in Union prisoner of war camps. Since both sides predicted a short war, neither prepared for large numbers of prisoners of war during the 4 years of the conflict. As prisoners were taken, commanders usually worked out exchanges among themselves. Soon an exchange system was accepted by both governments, but failed to work due to a variety of disagreements that arose. The number of prisoners of war increased and prison facilities on both sides became severely overcrowded. Mismanagement, lack of adequate planning, retaliation, and many other factors led to suffering by prisoners on each side. By the end of the war, camps such as Andersonville suffered from a lack of supplies and experienced extremely high mortality rates, as well as death and desertion by many of its guards. During the 14 months of its existence, Andersonville accounted for 43% of all Union deaths during the Civil War. This museum goes in depth to talk about the prisoners of war from other wars, such as the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War. Alan Marsh concludes, saying, "The men and women of this country who have been forced by circumstances to become prisoners of war truly know the meaning of freedom. They know it has not come free. Their story is one of sacrifice and courage, their legacy, the gift of liberty." In the back of the museum is this beautiful waterfall and monument dedicated to the prisoners of war, but beyond that is Andersonville. There are two different ways to view the park, and one is to actually walk around and hike different areas, and the other is that you can drive your car and do a little bit of a driving tour to stop at the various historical places and monuments. I chose to do a lot of hiking and walking through this park because I wanted to have the opportunity to feel what it was like to actually live here in Andersonville. And I visited here during the summer, where sometimes the temperature is somewhere near 100 degrees with the heat index, and it is very hot. So it gives you some sort of perspective as to not only how hot it could be, but think about during the winter here in Georgia how cold it could be, because during December and January here in Georgia the temperatures can drop to about 30 degrees and even colder than that if you factor in the wind chill. These are the prisoners' shelters at Andersonville. The prisoners had to provide their own shelters with sticks and pieces of clothing. The prisoners improvised leaky tents and lean-tos. Many prisoners had no shelter at all. Protection from rain, dew, and the boiling sun became a matter of life or death. Exposure aggravated the many illnesses and infections and contributed to the soaring mortality rate. Andersonville was one of the largest Confederate prisoner of war camps. Of the 45,000 Union soldiers confined here, nearly 13,000 died. What you're seeing now in these pictures and video are the earthwork defenses that are here at Andersonville. Half the cannon faced outward to defend against Union cavalry raids, spin-offs from Sherman's Atlanta campaign. The other half were loaded with canister and trained on the prison grounds. When the prison was operating, deep ditches fronted the earthworks. Palisades closed the rear of the V-shaped gun emplacements. This is the expanded stockade. The unhewn logs with daylight between them betray the Confederates' haste to expand the north end of the camp. In contrast, the reconstruction at the North Gate section shows the carefully planned design of the stockade's initial 16 acres, when officials planned for only 6,000 prisoners. The outer row of the white posts mark the perimeter of the stockade. Inner posts mark the deadline. The area between was a no man's land. If prisoners crossed the deadline, guards in the sentry boxes had orders to shoot them. This downstream end of Stockade Branch was the site of the camp's sinks or latrines. According to the Confederates' original plan, prisoners would get drinking water upstream and use latrines downstream where the current would flush sewage out of the camp. Inadvertently, the prison was designed for death. Stockade posts slowed the drainage, and during dry spells the creek became more swamp than flowing stream. Dysentery swept the camp. This is Star Fort. Within this stronghold stood the offices of the post commander and the prison commandant. Fort and headquarters were symbols of power, but the fully enclosed earthworks also reflect the authorities' besieged state of mind. Hampered by the supply shortages and a constant influx of new prisoners, Confederates here were responsible for operating a prison camp under conditions they could hardly control. 4 of the Star Fort's guns were trained outward to repel Union cavalry raids. The other 5 cannon were aimed toward the north slope of the prison camp. Now we're on our way to the North Gate. This trail follows in the footsteps of newly arriving prisoners. Captured Union soldiers march from the village railroad station past this spot and uphill to the North Gate, the main prison entrance. After prisoners passed through the outer door, it was barred behind them. Then the inner gate swung open on the prison yard. New arrivals, or fresh fish as they were often called, had no idea what awaited for them here. Once inside, men exclaimed, "Is this hell?" Verily, the great mass of gaunt, unnatural-looking beings, soot-begrimed and clad in filthy tatters, that we saw stalking about inside this pen looked, indeed, as if they might belong to a world of lost spirits. W.B. Smith, 14th Illinois Infantry, October 9th, 1864. When the inner gate swung open, new prisoners had their first vision of life inside. The noise, the stench, the crowd of emancipated men desperate for news must have been overwhelming. Anything of value, money, buttons, clothing, might be coined or stolen from them. Even worse was the sight of other prisoners. In those skeletal forms and lifeless eyes, a new prisoner could foresee his own fate. This is Providence Spring. During a heavy rainstorm on October 14, 1864, a spring suddenly gushed from this hillside. The prisoners were desperate for fresh water, and over time the event became legendary. Several men claimed to have seen lightning strike this spot just before the spring burst forth. This damp slope, with its many natural seats, would appear to be a likely site for a spring. Workmen may have inadvertently buried the spring's outlet while digging the stockade trench. Whether an act of nature or divine providence, the effect of the stream was an answer to prayers of thousands. At this corner of the prison, the state of Wisconsin erected a monument near the site where many Wisconsin prisoners had camped. Prisoners tended to form groups by state or regiment to sustain morale. Where so little historical evidence remains, symbols of commemoration have been an important part of Andersonville's physical and emotional landscape. The ground at this end of the prison is pocked with deep holes, either tunnels or wells. Overcrowding disguised the digging. Beneath the sea of tattered shelters, prisoners could work undetected with mess plates, spoons, and canteen halves. It is tempting to call every excavation an escape tunnel, but many may have been wells. With the camp stream lethally polluted, the search for fresh water was as urgent as the need to escape. This is the cemetery at Andersonville. The prisoners' headstones are only inches apart. As the death rate at Andersonville escalated to 100 per day, officials abandoned the use of pine box coffins and had the bodies buried shoulder to shoulder in trenches. At first, only numbered stakes marked the prisoners' graves. The dead might have remained unidentified except for the efforts of Dorrance Atwater, a former prisoner. In the summer of 1867, someone photographed the prisoners' graves from the same perspective. Names and unit numbers in the historic photo match the information on the present headstones. The markers in this photograph are wooden headboards. In 1878, they were replaced by marble headstones. Otherwise, this part of the cemetery has changed little since the Civil War. In 1911, the state of New York erected this granite monument to honor its troops who died in Andersonville prison. Large monuments were a fashion of the time, built on a scale that would symbolize the prisoners' enormous sacrifice. There are 12 monuments in this cemetery and 11 at the nearby prison site. Each has a unique design. Because so little remains of the historic prison, the monuments form a prominent part of the Andersonville landscape. This is Salvatore Vinciguerra. Thank you for watching this video on the Andersonville National Historic Site and National Prisoner of War Museum in Andersonville, Georgia. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to this channel, and have a great day. Thank you.